Welcome back, everybody. Today we're talking about cycling, and we'll be talking about it from two perspectives. One is if you're the driver sharing the road with cyclists, and the other perspective if you're a cyclist, and some of the rules and regulations and issues that might occur. We have Adriana and Jessica here from the TL2D team, and we have Matt Sweet from the city of Mississauga. He's the manager of active transportation. So Matt, if you wouldn't mind, I'll ask you first to just explain what active transportation means.
Sure. Thanks, Anne-Marie, and thanks for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate the invite. So active transportation really tries to capture walking, cycling, and other sort of more active forms of getting around. So in my group, we even get into talking about things like bike share and e-scooters and things of that nature. And we also talk about encouraging other modes of transportation. We work with transit as well and stuff. So it's a pretty wide ranging portfolio, but one of the biggest components of our portfolio is obviously the cycling component.
Which is really important today, and encouraging people to become more active, because it's better from a health perspective, and it's certainly better from a planet perspective. I mean, you hear today we're talking about, incredible heat waves in Europe and throughout the southern US, and that's all global warming. So being more active using alternate forms of transportation than vehicles is a good way to go. So thanks for joining us today. And we're going to start talking about sharing the road with cycles from the driver's perspective. And Jessica, you had a story about that.
I did, yes. So my story was actually about a year ago. I had been, I'm somebody who loves to ride my bicycle just throughout the neighborhood, and I live fairly close to a grocery store. So I had been riding my bicycle to the grocery store, and as I am cycling through the bike lane, I noticed there was a car parked in said lane. There wasn't any other cars in the road, so I felt it was safe enough for me to kind of just quickly go around the car until the individual was actually in the vehicle and began to open the front passenger door. Luckily, I wasn't injured. I was able to kind of swerve around quickly enough, but I could have been very seriously injured, and that car was obviously not supposed to be there.
You could have been injured by the door, or if you'd swerved out into traffic, injured by a passing vehicle. So a really dangerous situation. So I guess one of the things we want to talk about there, Matt, is about bike lanes and cars parking in bike lanes.
Generally speaking, that is illegal. So in Mississauga, for example, we just passed a bylaw to set up fines for doing just that. And other cities have had those fines in place for a little bit longer. City of Toronto, for example, there was a pretty good social media presence for their bicycle bylaw enforcement officers who would go out and ticket vehicles that were parked in or blocking bike lanes. So that is something that is generally prohibited. Usually there are no parking signs put up by the city to reinforce that as well. But as a general rule, yeah, you're not supposed to be parking in bike lanes.
And then, of course, that is that situation that you're talking about now is called commonly dooring, and how to avoid that. And one of the things that I've read about that from a driver's perspective is called the Dutch Reach. And we're talking now about Vision Zero, which is an attempt to eliminate deaths and serious injuries on roads. And it began in Sweden. And so that part of Europe has been more active. We're a little late to the game when it comes to really making changes to eliminate deaths and serious injuries versus our European neighbors. So one of the things, the Netherlands has been very, they've moved to largely cycling. And all over Amsterdam, you see people on bicycles. But the thing that they've developed to help with avoid dooring, is the Dutch Reach, where you open the door with your furthest hand, your furthest away hand, instead of your closest hand, which most of us do all the time. That forces you to turn to look over your shoulder before you open the door. And I think it's a really good habit for people to get into. Do you have any other suggestions there, Matt, for ways to make sure that we don't accidentally open a door in front of somebody?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things to keep in mind is that whether there's a bicycle lane there or not, that especially in our larger cities and urban centers, there's going to be people riding bicycles in those areas. And just to kind of put your mind to that is that whether or not there's a painted line on the road or whether or not there's a path next to the road, people on bicycles are likely to be using the road generally. So just to be aware of your surroundings at all times. I think the Dutch Reach is a really good tool that we can use. But again, I think generally when you're getting out of a vehicle where you're parked on the road, you should be checking your blind spots and looking around you before you open the door anyways. Because if you open the door into a cyclist, the cyclist is going to end up on the worst end of that. If you open your door into a car, your car door is going to end up on the worst end of that. So it's just a general good practice anyways. But, as the driver, thinking about the person who might be riding their bicycle, you have a duty of care to look out for the other road user because, like I say, they're the ones who's going to end up on the worst end of it.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I'm thinking that there's kind of a traditional almost animosity between cyclists and drivers. And drivers, in many cases, and myself included for a long time, kind of look at the road system as being for cars. It was built for cars. And other users are kind of infringing on the car space. And part of Vision Zero is to recognize that the cars really are for everyone, whether you're a pedestrian or a cyclist, and that we all have a place on the car and everybody needs to be protected. And of course, in a car, you have protection all around you. On a bicycle, you don't. As a pedestrian, you don't. Yep. And so the bigger responsibility is on the driver. Adriana, you had a story you wanted to share there too.
Yes, I did. So this was a couple of years back. A friend of mine, we cycle a lot. We like to go on like the bike lanes and everything. And we were in a bike lane about to cross the intersection when a car pulled up and actually made a right turn into one of us. And my friend actually went flying off his bike because the car didn't check that we were in the bike lane. So that's sort of what happened with us. But I remember that was scary because we were there and we could see like a car pulled up and we would assume that they sort of saw us as a biker, but then they just decided to make a turn for whatever reason. They were in a rush and one of us unfortunately got hit. But I remember that's what happened with us. And that was a really unfortunate situation. No one got too badly hurt, but I think my friend ended up fracturing their arm in that situation. Yeah, unfortunately,
we in the past have looked at roads as being for cars, and one of the changes that was made over the years in order to keep traffic moving was allowing people to turn right on a red light, right? And so cars take that responsibility. Now, this comes back to the animosity between cyclists and cars. Cyclists don't always pay attention to the lights. We'll talk about that a little more when we're looking at the perspective of cyclists, but they don't always stop at stop signs or red lights, that kind of thing. But so turning right on red, I mean, where are you looking? You should be scanning the road for sure. But typically people end up looking at where the traffic is coming from and don't look to check. So even the bicycle that's pulled up that isn't going to enter the intersection can get caught when a car goes to make that right turn without looking. And that's why every time you make a right turn, you must scan the road effectively, but then double check that side mirror to make sure that there's not a pedestrian running up or a cyclist coming up on the inside.
Yeah, I know after that as a driver, like I always check now, like because like before I would maybe neglect it a couple of times, but like now I'm always like, okay, I need to make sure, because once you're like in the other position, you're like, okay, I need to make sure that as a driver I'm checking because I know what it was like. Yeah.
But the thing is, I mean, you don't want people only to have an almost terrible situation and then we learn from it. That's what the podcast is about, to kind of get people to understand this could happen. So we develop those really good, safe behaviors and don't have to almost hit somebody.
Mhm.
CAA is one of our partners, and they have a great like piece of tape that says check for cyclists that you put on your side mirror,
Mhm.
your right side mirror. And if you can get one of those, I mean, it just makes you mindful that cyclists come up on the inside there. Anything you want to add about that, Matt?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's different scenarios where that specific situation can occur. If there is a designated bicycle lane, then it's natural and it makes sense that the bicycle is in their own lane and they advance to the intersection, and they're probably in a lot of situations, skipping the queue, so to speak, of the vehicles that are waiting in their lane. And in some situations, will allow cars to encroach into the bike lane to make the right turn. And in some situations we don't, from like an engineering perspective. And so in those situations, the cyclist is in their own space. And, that's just, again, it's down to awareness of all the road users and sort of that shared responsibility piece. But then there are other situations where everyone's sharing the same lane. And in busy urban environments or even in non-busier situations, somebody on a bicycle can come up along the right side, alongside cars, and try to jump the queue that way without their own dedicated lane. That's a situation where the person on the bicycle really needs to be aware of what they're doing, and I think, and take a little bit of responsibility of what they're doing. But to me, a part of it comes down to like defensive driving for all users, right? So even as somebody on a bicycle, driving defensively, riding your bicycle defensively, and being aware of what's around you and looking and seeing, okay, are there vehicles that I'm kind of jumping the queue on the right-hand side that may be making that right turn, keeping an eye out for that, or being aware of that and positioning yourself accordingly. A lot of times in situations like that, when we have bicycle skills training, like the CAN bike program, for example, we would say it's better to line up in the queue rather than to jump on the right-hand side and try to get around things, just because it eliminates that possibility. And if you're queued up at a signal anyways, you're not going to be going any faster or slower than anybody else. So it's not like you're holding up traffic to get in line and sort of take the lane in those situations. But that, not everybody's comfortable doing that. So there's a lot of components to that issue. But again, I think shared responsibility, defensive driving, defensive operation of a vehicle or a bicycle. I think those sorts of approaches can really help.
Do you have any examples of defensive driving as a cyclist? Because I haven't heard that term used too often, so I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, so it really does come from that CAN bike sort of philosophy. And CAN bike is a good skills training framework, and I've gone through and I at one time was certified as an instructor. That may have lapsed at this point, but I may have let that one lapse. But it really tries to take the similar sort of principles of defensive driving of a motor vehicle and apply them to when you're riding a bike. And really, it's looking at it from the perspective of a bicyclist vehicle, and in situations where you don't have dedicated space, so where you are sharing the road with cars in the same space. So yeah, things like lining up in queue and not jumping queues, making sure that you're visible, by being predictable. What's another term, like destination planning? So like when you're coming up to a decision point, positioning yourself on the roadway so that everybody can hopefully intuitively understand where you're going. So if you're going to make a left turn, get yourself over into the left turn lane and stay there and be in the center of the lane. I think we'll talk at some point about where on the road you should be when you're riding a bike. The Highway Traffic Act says on the right hand side of the road as far as is practicable, which basically means if it's safe to be about a meter from the curb, that's fine. If it's not safe for a variety of reasons, be in the middle of the lane. So So those are the sorts of things that the Can Bike school of thinking kind of teaches. But again, when we get into now, Anne-Marie mentioned the Netherlands and some of the ways of getting around in that country and in other countries that we look to. They've been building things like dedicated bike lanes or paths or cycle tracks for 50 years, and we've been doing it relatively well for about 10, I would say. That's a wide
Well, we're
generalization.
lucky because we can learn what they did from
We can learn what they did,
Yeah.
but again, so we are catching up, to your point that you raised earlier. Like, we are catching up, but the more that we have that dedicated space, then the thinking has to change too. So like the types of teaching that we do for defensive driving as a cyclist, like the lessons we teach are going to change and adapt along with it.
You mentioned Can Bike. That's CANBIKE.
Yes.
How would people find out more about that? And is there a cost for it?
The cost, there is usually a cost. It's like taking a driver's skills course. Generally speaking, your city would offer it either through like a rec program or some other type of offering. I think City of Toronto offers it through their rec programs. People get certified as instructors and then will teach the course kind of on contract. So there is a centralized website for it as well for Can Bike. I don't have the URL handy right now, but
we'll look it up.
It's easy to find, and they can connect you to sort of local course offerings. And they have it for all levels, all experience levels. Like, so if you're somebody who's never ridden a bicycle before, then they'll have a course offering for that. They're not the only game in town. There are others as well that will give sort of those basic trainings, but the Can Bike has sort of like a graduated, almost like swimming lessons. Again, like they have graduated sort of course offerings.
Is it recommended for like younger children as well? Because I know when I was younger, I would bike to school, like in middle school. So I'm sure knowing some things probably would have been useful at that time for safety reasons.
Well, it sure wouldn't hurt.
Yeah.
Like I say, when it's offered, it's a really good program. Again, sometimes locally it can be a challenge to get instructors to offer the course and get enough interest drummed up to actually run the courses and things like that. But when it's offered, I think it's beneficial. Like I say, it has some caveats. Like, it really takes that bike as a vehicle approach and mindset. So you have to be kind of comfortable doing that style of riding. So it's not for everybody, but I think it does have some benefits.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a chicken and egg thing though too, that the more knowledge you have, the more comfortable you become. So I think that even just knowing more about how to ride and share the road with vehicles is would encourage people to ride more often.
I think that's a really good point. And going back to what Adriana had said about, you're learning these things when you're younger and you're having your parents teach you. Well, unfortunately, then when you're someone like me who likes to ride their bike to, for example, the grocery store or any other department store, now all of a sudden I'm sharing the road with cars. And unfortunately, that's not something that your parents are going to teach you when you're 8 years old learning to ride a bicycle. So I definitely think that's something that would be very beneficial.
I agree. In fact, one of our ambassadors created a video where he talked about the safest place to ride is on the sidewalk. And it is when you're really little, but at some point you need to move on to the road. And maybe, Matt, you can give us a few tips for at what point people should be moving on to the road.
Yeah, so I think you're right. Like, when you're learning when you're a kid, it's a good place. Because obviously you're going to be figuring out how to handle the bicycle and maneuver, and you don't want to be in a space where you're vulnerable to people driving cars around. So the sidewalk is a safe place. Generally, so in Mississauga, we say that if your bicycle has a wheel diameter of less than 50 centimeters, then you can be on the sidewalk. And the spirit of that is that so kids can ride their bikes on the sidewalk. And then once you get to be older, a little more experienced, then you move on to the roadway. I think ultimately it is down to sort of the individual's kind of comfort level, because there's plenty of adults who are riding on the sidewalks today. And it's defined as a very big problem by a lot of people, and it's not ideal, and it's not a particularly safe place because, again, in theory, people are not expecting somebody on a bicycle to be riding on the sidewalk. They're expecting people who are walking to be using the sidewalk. So again, from a predictability and looking at other road users perspective, it can be challenging, and usually, like, sidewalks are crossing driveway entrances and commercial driveways and other things like that. So from that perspective, it's not the safest place to be. But I can also understand and empathize with the fact that a lot of people are not comfortable sharing the roads, so that's where they're choosing to ride. For us, from like an engineering and a planning perspective, we look at that and say, okay, well, that means that there's a large proportion of the population who are not going to be willing, no matter, and I take the point that you were making earlier, and we were talking about CAMBike, about how, the more knowledge you have and the more training you have, maybe the more comfortable you'll be in some of those share the road type of situations. There's a lot of people who just won't be. And, which is understandable, I think. So then from a planning and infrastructure perspective, we look at that and say, okay, we need to provide more dedicated space that is actually separated from motor vehicle users. So some people have said that when you see a lot of people riding on the sidewalk, that's actually a data point that we can use to say, oh, well, that's where we need to put a separated bike lane or a cycle track. So it kind of is kind of turning it a little bit on its head.
Okay. And then we also have a lot of bike paths, right?
Yep.
Where people can bike very safely and not have to interact with vehicles except, very few intersections, that kind of stuff, and more for leisure riders. I mean, you're out in a Sunday afternoon with your family. I mean, that's a great thing to do. Get on a bike and go for a ride.
Yep.
One of the other things that came up, and I can't remember whether it was Adriana or Jessica that was talking about what kinds of roads you should be riding on. I think maybe Adriana, you had a story about that.
Yeah, I think that was me. We were up in Huntsville and decided to bike to Ottawa just for fun. Yeah, everyone's like, that doesn't sound like fun. It was me and my dad, and we were going to bike on the highway, and not 400 series, but we went on the municipal highways, and we found that there was no like designated bike area. There was no shoulder either. So we found that it was so dangerous that we actually had to sort of come back. So like, at least for me, I'm not entirely sure like what highways, other than I know we can't bike on 400, what we should be riding on, or what we could have done in like that situation, other than turn back, since there was no designated safe space for us.
Yeah.
Trying to bike.
Yeah. So the 400 series highways are explicitly prohibited for reasons that should be obvious, I think. But in terms of other sort of like, what would I describe them at, like lower scale, for lack of a better term, like sort of provincial highways out in rural areas, generally speaking, there's no prohibition on those unless there's some sort of explicit signage or otherwise that's put up, and so that would kind of be at provincial discretion. But again, the Highway Traffic Act says that a bicycle is a vehicle and can use the roadway other than 400 series highways or otherwise prohibited. So but that's not to say that it makes sense to ride on some of those highways. Like you say, like if there's no paved shoulder, or even if there's like a granular shoulder on a highway out in the country, A, it's not very comfortable. B, I don't think I would enjoy riding in that space. I think it would feel like you were taking forever to get anywhere, but that's just me. So yeah, like there's no specific rules on that, but again, I think it's just down to common sense. The province is doing it, I think, over the last several years, a reasonably good job of creating like a provincial cycling network, and they have certain highways that are sort of actually demarcated for that, and they have made improvements like to create shoulders and pave shoulders in space, and they'll have, whether it's painted lines or they'll have like the rumble strips between sort of the main part of the road and the shoulder, so that cars are discouraged from encroaching into that space. So they've been doing a reasonably good job over the years of building that out.
Matt, where
I
would
think there's
people
more to
find
be done.
information about that? Like if because I think that's very interesting that there's a network that would connect cities or villages or whatever.
Yeah.
But where would people find information about that?
I would say one of the best places to go, because really when we're talking about that type of riding, it's a tourism type of a
Yeah.
thing, right? And I think Adrian, I think that's kind of what you were talking about. Is like it was a vacation, it was a leisurely thing, trying to go from Huntsville to Ottawa, and God bless you for even considering that trip. But I think one of the best places to go for that type of information is it's called Ontario by Bike. And
Oh,
they
okay.
do basically their whole mandate is promoting bike tourism in the province, and they worked to they work with the municipalities in the different regions to promote bike friendly destinations. They work with businesses and things, but they also they have those resources to tell you what the safe routes between the different destinations are. So Ontario by Bike.
Oh, Adriana,
Wow.
you and your dad definitely need to check that out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know we're thinking of biking up to Niagara at some point, so it'd be interesting to try and map it out ahead of time instead of just hopping on and hoping for the best.
Yeah, the other thing about roads like that and riding at the side of the roads, and I've seen people do this, and they're kind of going down the middle of the road and on a two-lane highway, one in each direction.
Yep.
And of course, cars come up behind them and then go to pass them.
Mhm.
And come pretty darn close to that cyclist. Now, if I were on that bicycle, I'd be scared to death of the breeze of cars going by. But what's the rule about passing passing cycles if you're in a vehicle, Matt?
Yeah, so this is a fairly recent change that was made to the Highway Traffic Act. And it says that when you're passing somebody on a bicycle, you have to leave 1 meter of space. It does provide that where practical, clause or qualifier, but that's the guidance. And in the event that there was an incident and it was found that you did not leave 1 meter of space, you can be subject to additional fines and demerit points for not leaving that much space. So that's the rule. Again, the principle is that the person on the bicycle is a lot more vulnerable as a road user in that situation. So the person in the car has, like I say, a higher duty of care to leave that space.
One of the stories that came from one of our team members was about riding on a highway like that, a low speed 90-kilometer highway. And the car came right up behind them and actually bumped the back of the bike. And for what reason, I mean, really unclear, whether they couldn't see the cyclist, whether they were distracted and not looking, whether they didn't judge the distance properly. What it comes down to is people maybe not expecting bikes in areas like that and just not paying attention.
I think that's true. I think that there are roads, and again it varies by region, but there are roads where the city or region will put up signs to try to highlight that these are routes that are popular for recreational cycling or bike tourism, or tours, like groups that are riding out in those areas. But it does, again, it just comes down to sort of that shared responsibility piece. And there's nothing to say that somebody on a bicycle can't be on that road and using it in that way. And then you just have to be aware of your surroundings as somebody who's driving.
And we really need to change that mindset. Sorry there, Jessica, I cut you off, but it's changing that mindset that the roads are for everybody.
Yep.
I was just going to say that, although I think that there are some cyclists who lack some knowledge and therefore don't feel as comfortable, I do think that whether you're a cyclist or not, or even just a driver on the road, you should still be educating yourself on the rules of the road and exactly what that shared responsibility should be looking like. Because although you have a responsibility as a cyclist to ensure that you are on those roads that are safe and you are doing the necessary precautions, I do think as a driver, you need to also understand what their precautions are and what those boundaries are in order to create that safer environment.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I guess the other thing we wanted to talk about as a cyclist, then, how can you protect yourself? So what key gear do you need? I mean, certainly helmets, and maybe talk a little bit about helmets and keeping your bicycle visible too.
Sure, yeah. Helmets is one of those things that I was just going to say the word no brainer, but that seemed like too obvious of a pun. But I had to now.
We'd hope it'd be a no-brainer.
I had to point it out explicitly. It is a no-brainer, but obviously there's lots of people who choose not to wear a helmet. Once you're over 18 years old, there's no law that says you have to wear a helmet when you ride your bicycle. And that's Highway Traffic Act, and that's been that way for a long time. But I know my friends at Public Health would be quite upset with me if I didn't say that it's a good idea to wear a helmet, and it certainly does you no harm to wear it. And in the event that you do have an incident, it obviously provides a lot of protection. And I know personally friends who, when not wearing a helmet, have had an incident on their bicycle and have had concussions and have had consequences from that decision. Generally, being on a bicycle is a safe thing to do, but it's like I say, it does you no harm, and it certainly helps in the event that you do have an incident. Aside from helmets, lights and reflectors are again required by law and obviously a good idea. And a horn or a bell also legally required to have some type of audible device on your bike. So that you can use that to alert other road users to your presence as required. So when you buy a bicycle, typically they come equipped with reflectors, but they don't generally come equipped with lights or a horn or a bell. So you have to make sure to get those things on your own. It's a weird deficiency in sort of the system. I mean, cars, you don't have to buy the horn on your car separately and have it installed after the fact, but for a bicycle you do. So those things are absolutely key, and again required by law, so making sure to have those.
I'm surprised to learn that helmets aren't legally required after 18. Like I would have assumed that they would have been a legal requirement.
I think it's a constant debate. And there are other jurisdictions where it is required. British Columbia, for example, does require helmets for everybody. And I think most of Australia as well. You have to wear a helmet no matter how old you are. Again, there's a debate on that. Again, like I say, wearing a helmet does no harm, and it helps you in the event of an incident. But on the flip side, it's, cycling is generally a very safe activity. So we don't need to get into that debate here now, but
so cool too. You can get like ladybug looking ones, or like I love them. Like
I can totally see you in a ladybug, Adriana.
Yeah,
that's definitely Adriana.
One of the things about helmets, actually, which is important to know, and if you're buying it for yourself, but also buying it for kids, like there's lots of kids helmets. My daughter has a bike helmet that has cat ears on it.
Yeah.
Strictly speaking, by the book, not really actually above board. Like a helmet there are certifications for your helmet. So there's it's like CASM and ASM, I think, are the two certifications. I might have those abbreviations a little bit wrong, but so you're supposed to have a certified helmet that meets safety and testing requirements. Helmets that have extra, stuff on them, like say like cat ears, or my daughter had we saw one that had like a tiara on it, things like that. Those sorts of little extra things, they're not technically supposed to be on a helmet, because in the event that you do fall, it's the sort of thing that can break off and maybe becomes like a flying obstacle or something, and or it affects the performance of the helmet. So that's me being curmudgeonly and saying buy a helmet that's not fancy, but it's probably an important thing to keep in mind when you're shopping.
Yeah.
Well, if it's just painted, I mean, that would be okay. Sure. Anyway, so you'd be all right with that one. Oh, hand signals. Yes. And I can tell you, for all the time that I am driving around bicycles, almost never do I see cyclists using hand signals. Mm-hmm. There was a company that tried to build helmets with indicator lights on them. Yeah. But it never happened. I mean, I don't know maybe it was too complicated. I don't know. Uh-huh. But so you have to use hand signals to be predictable. And almost never do I see cyclists indicating which way they're going.
Yeah. And it's the same hand signals that that you learn when you do your driver's training, right? And that's why sometimes people will ask, well, why when you're signaling for a right turn, do you stick your left hand out and put it up in an L? Well, that's because if you're driving a vehicle, you can't very well stick your other hand out and pass the side window because you can't reach
Exactly.
that far. So, so the hand signals are the same and they're intended to be universal. But of course, because bicycles, to your point, Anne-Marie, don't have turn signals on them, then somebody who's riding a bicycle needs to use those hand signals. So yeah, they're obviously really important. And like I say, I was going to say, and I'm going to do a quick show of hands for all of us here, who has a driver's license and also rides a bicycle, right? So, you know, a lot of these trainings and a lot of these skills are common across, regardless of whether you're driving or riding a bike. And the hand signals is a great example of that. So it's the same hand signals that you would see in the driver's manual. And hopefully you remembered and you answered correctly when you wrote that first test to get your license. So just kind of keep that in mind and carry that knowledge across, no matter how you're traveling, whether you're driving or riding a bike.
Which brings us to, I guess, the last point of irritation between motorists and cyclists. And that is that cyclists don't always pay attention to the red light, to the yellow light, to the stop sign. I've seen all kinds of versions of it. I mean, when you're riding your bicycle on the road, you're a vehicle. So you need to act like a vehicle. I've seen people, as the light turns, now they go into the pedestrian crosswalk and ride through there and then pick up on the other side, that kind of thing. And it's just a reminder that if you're riding on the road, you are a vehicle and you need to act like a vehicle.
Yeah, no, 100%. Like all the different traffic control devices, to use a technical term, stop signs, traffic signals, pedestrian crossings, and PXOs and things. You know, they apply equally to all road users, and everybody has a responsibility to use those appropriately and properly. But it's, you know, the angst between the different types of users. I mean, I'll refer back to my hands up exercise a second ago. Like, most people who are riding bicycles also have their driver's license, also drive cars. Most people who drive cars occasionally ride bicycles. Not everybody, but most, you know. So it's kind of like there needs to be a little bit more of that empathy piece. That everybody just needs to be aware that, you know, it's not a cyclist. We're not defined by the type of vehicle we happen to be using on the road at any particular time. You know, it's just another person, and they just happen to be on a bicycle. But yeah. And so to extend that a little bit more, you know, how many people in cars do rolling stops for stop signs, you know, and that's not to say that, you know, we shouldn't hold everybody the same standard, and we should. And there's enough people who are angry about rolling stops. You know, if you live at a corner in a residential road with an all-way stop and you're out in your front lawn, you're going to get mad about all those people doing rolling stops in front of your house too. So as long as we're equally outraged,
that's
everybody
right.
who's breaking the rules, then we're good. But yeah, you know, as an individual who's on a bicycle, you know, I need to be thinking again of that defensive driving mindset. I want to put myself in the safest situation possible, and not do something that's going to put myself in a risky spot. And then as a driver, I want to do the same thing, and I'm hoping that everybody else on the road is taking the same approach.
And the understanding that the roads are really for everyone.
Uh-huh.
And because I hear now, oh, well, it was 2 lanes. Now it's 1 lane and a bike lane, and nobody's biking. Well, nobody may be biking today, but the more people become comfortable with it and realize they're not going to get hit, that should shift.
Yep.
And especially when people are really aware of health and global warming, it's a change we really need to make.
Yeah.
And that's why the roads are being redesigned. And yes, I mean, it's I've talked to one counselor who said somebody complained in her area, and she actually, and oh my God, it's going to take me, half an hour longer to get to, and she went and drove it. And she said, it's a 3-minute difference or a 2-minute difference. And isn't that 2 minutes worth kind of saving the planet or encouraging somebody's health? And I think that's the way we really need to be looking at it now, but you want everybody to be safe. So thank you all very much. Matt, thank you for joining us today. Thank you always, Adriana and Jessica. And any final thoughts?
Thanks for the time. I appreciate it. It was a good conversation. Lots of good questions. And you didn't have to listen to me tell too many stupid jokes. So lucky for you.